As a misty rain fell on the morning of January 28, 1966, the drone of 100 helicopters carrying soldiers into the southern end of the Bong Son Plain pierced the silent gray skies. This movement was the opening for Operation Masher, a determined effort to eliminate the enemy presence in the fertile An Lao Valley. As the first helicopters neared their objectives, the enemy let loose automatic weapons fire. The remaining choppers began to land in various locations to avoid being hit. With the GIs scattered, fire intensified. Firmly entrenched in earthworks, the NVA had the Americans in a murderous crossfire. The unit was so fragmented that soldiers had a difficult time finding each other. Driving rain made air and artillery support impossible. Captain John Fesmire screamed into the radio to a battalion headquarters, quote, "We're in a hornet's nest." The troopers were cut off in the fight of their lives as darkness approached. The poor visibility was ideal for the enemy, who tried to infiltrate the perimeter throughout the night and make this the graveyard of the famous 1st Cavalry Division. The fateful battle took place only 4 months after the unit's arrival in Vietnam and 2 months after the bloody engagement in Nha Trang. After the air assault tactic proved to be quite effective, General Westmoreland decided to take more out of these guys. General Harry Kennard, in commander of the division, received the order to launch Operation Masher. The goal of the mission was to find the remnants of the North Vietnamese Army regulars and Viet Cong fighters in the Binh Dien province and destroy them. The mission was assigned to the division's 3rd Brigade under the command of Colonel Hal Moore. It was to be conducted in cooperation with the South Vietnamese Army's 22nd Division, the Republic of Korea Capital Division, and the Marines, who devised their own operation called Double Eagle. Air Cav was planned to assault the enemy troops on the Bong Son Plain and in the mountains and valleys that bordered it and push them north toward the Marines. The 3rd Brigade consisted of 2 battalions, the 1st and 2nd of the 7th Cavalry Regiment. However, for this mission, it was reinforced with the 1st and 2nd Battalions of the 12th Cavalry and reconnaissance helicopters of the 1st Squadron of the 9th Cavalry. All in all, Moore had at his disposal more than 7,500 men. Opposite them stood 2 regiments of the North Vietnamese Army and 1 Viet Cong regiment. However, a much bigger problem was that the entire province of Binh Dien, with a population of around 800,000, had its hearts and minds set on the communist side. The territory that the cavalrymen were about to enter was anything but friendly. Soon, they would learn the hard way. Even before the operation started, the 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry received signs that it would not go as smoothly as their commanders had imagined. On January 25th, 3 days before the operation would start, the unit boarded a dozen C-123 transport planes for the ride to the area of operation. During the flight, one of the aircraft carrying men from the Alpha Company, for no reason, turned at a sharp angle, started losing altitude, and crashed into the mountain. All 42 soldiers and 4 crew members lost their lives in a devastating explosion. It was a grim omen of even worse things to come. On January 28th, Operation Masher had finally begun. The South Vietnamese and Korean troops got hold of Highways 1 and 19, while the South Vietnamese Airborne Brigade went on the search and destroy mission northeast of Bong Son. At the same time, 4,000 Marines stormed the beaches of southern Quang Ngai province, aiming to link up with the Air Cav. As for the 3rd Brigade, soldiers of the 1st and 2nd Battalion of the 7th Cavalry were airlifted to several landing zones along the southern end of Bong Son. All companies landed without significant problems, some with no opposition at all, while others encountered weak resistance. That is, all companies except for one. Charlie Company of the 2nd Battalion was dropped on Landing Zone 4, a sandy plain between the hamlet of Phung Du and Cu Ni. Both of these hamlets were like a maze of rice fields with levees and dikes, surrounded by palm trees, hedgerows, and bamboo shrubs. A notable feature of the area was a large cemetery south of Phung Du, distinguished by small mounds that marked the grave sites. Helicopters carrying the lead elements of the Charlie Company approached the landing zone without prior artillery preparation. Because it was too close to the hamlets, there was a fear that artillery fire might cause unwanted civilian casualties. It seemed like the right call because when the first flight landed at 0825, it was met with no reaction from the enemy. However, when 10 minutes later the second flight approached, all hell broke loose. Enemy soldiers entrenched through the hamlets opened fire from machine guns and mortars. The welcome party consisted of the entire 7th Battalion of the 22nd Regiment, reinforced by a heavy weapons company. Captain Fesmire waved the helicopters to fly away to a different landing zone. He expected them to go further away from his position where they could approach the enemy. Instead, the flight dropped the troops at 4 different spots, just behind Fesmire's positions. 10 minutes later, the 3rd flight dropped the rest of the company at the 5th location, also nearby. The entire Charlie Company landed at LZ-4 by 0845, but was so scattered that they couldn't establish communications with each fire. The enemy fire was so intense that they couldn't lift their heads, let alone move across the plain. Charlie Company was pinned down by a crossfire coming from 3 sides. Within minutes, the ground was covered with bodies of dead American soldiers. Many of them barely stepped out of the helicopters when they were hit. The only way to deal with the enemy was to call in an artillery strike. However, heavy rain started to fall and the barrage was called off. Even if it wasn't, it would have been too risky to use it. With soldiers all over the place, it would have been difficult to direct the shelling and avoid friendly fire. Nevertheless, a few rounds were fired at the site as the pinned-down soldiers needed to silence the enemy, even if only for a brief moment. The artillery fire did allow them to pull themselves together and return fire. Staff Sergeant William Geyer, in command of the mortar platoon, was pressed down by an enemy machine gun. With only a mortar tube and 6 rounds but no base plate or plotting board, Geyer improvised by propping the tube in the sand. He fired 5 rounds, watching them land without effect. Adjusting the tube one last time, he kissed the final round before firing. As the round flew toward its target, Geyer was struck in the head by a machine gun bullet and killed instantly. Though he didn't live to see it, his final round destroyed the enemy machine gun. Hours passed, but Charlie Company's position remained unchanged. Realizing that he might easily lose the entire company, the 2nd Battalion's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade, ordered Alpha Company to leave their zone and come to Charlie's aid. Soldiers of the Alpha Company approached LZ-4 from the south, moving toward the cemetery. They advanced without opposition until they reached a rice field immediately southwest of the landing zone, where they were met with heavy enemy fire. The company's 2 platoons hit the dirt and crawled across the field, each providing covering fire for the other. Such movement was extremely slow and resulted in heavy casualties, but allowed the Alpha Company to somehow reach the cemetery. Once there, soldiers took refuge in a large trench while others hid behind gravesite mounds. In the heat of the battle, Sergeant William Burkaw's squad fixed bayonets and prepared to charge a machine gun position hidden in a line of palm trees. Burkaw, for whom this was baptism of fire, believed the shock effect of a determined assault would turn the tide in the firefight. The squad moved swiftly, covering 50 meters in evasive maneuvers before dropping in the sand near the woodline. Astounded by Burkaw's charge, officers in the trench ordered them to fall back, opting to call in artillery instead. Following orders, Burkaw volunteered to cover the retreat, firing his M16 on full automatic. Kneeling in the open, he emptied magazine after magazine toward the enemy as tracers and bullets whizzed past him. His canteen was shot off, a bullet grazed his jungle boot, and another passed under his chin, tearing off the ring that secured his helmet strap. After firing 8 magazines, Burkaw was astonished to see that the enemy machine gun fell silent. Only then did he return to the cemetery with his men now providing covering fire. Burkaw later used to brag, "I had a duel with an enemy machine gun and I won." His bravery earned him the Bronze Star for his actions that day. In mid-afternoon, Lieutenant Colonel McDade landed at the edge of LZ-4, intending to take control of the situation as well as boost the morale of his men. He was followed by a flight carrying reinforcements from the Bravo Company. All 6 helicopters of the flight were hit by enemy fire and 2 were driven off. Only 1 platoon, led by company commander Captain Didruk, managed to jump off, but only to be caught in the middle of crossfire between American and North Vietnamese forces. In this chaos, they managed to break out and dig in. Despite the reinforcements, the situation at Landing Zone 4 looked grimmer than it was. Now, the entire 2nd Battalion was stuck and cut off. Charlie Company was in the worst position, its platoons and squads scattered across the plain and unable to get away from the enemy's devastating fire. The battalion was on the brink of annihilation. Brigade Commander Hal Moore was furious that one small landing zone had bogged down his entire operation. He let McDade know how displeased he was with the situation and urged him to sort it out. However, Hal Moore knew how difficult the position was for the 2nd Battalion, which is why he ordered the 2nd Battalion of the 12th Cavalry to get to LZ-4 and relieve it in the morning. That night, the plane was caught in a storm with strong winds and heavy rainfall. Visibility closed to little more than 200 meters, which allowed the Charlie Company to regroup under the cover of darkness. At the same time, a couple of soldiers from the Alpha Company crawled to Charlie's position and led them back to the relative safety of the cemetery. As dawn broke, the weather began to improve, allowing the airstrike to be carried out on enemy positions. A-1 Sky Raiders and B-57 Canberra bombers dropped loads of bombs and napalm on enemy positions east of the landing zone. Between each sortie, the artillery shelled the same area. On the morning of January 29th, Hal Moore landed at LZ-4, led by 2 companies of the 2nd Battalion and 12th Cavalry Regiment. His plan was to further reinforce his position at this site by bringing Delta forces. However, this plan failed as the Deltas got entangled in fierce engagement up north. Breaking through the rain of enemy bullets, Hal Moore reached McDade. After they had conferred, Colonel Moore moved about the battlefield despite the heavy fire, organizing the troops for an attack on the enemy position. "You can't do your job in a damn trench," he yelled at soldiers. Hal Moore's stance was exactly what they needed. In such a chaotic situation, they only wanted someone to lead them. When the low overcast lifted, Moore was able to call in tactical air support to help them finish the job. Fighter bombers strafed the skies over LZ-4, dropping heavy loads on enemy positions north of McDade's position. Some of the bombs hit enemy ammunition depots, causing large explosions. During the day, the 1st Battalion of the 7th Cavalry joined the battle by approaching the combat zone from the north. Moore himself then led 2 companies against the fortified enemy positions in the hamlets. Truth be told, the majority of the NVA troops had left their positions during the night, but they still left sufficient troops to hold the Americans. Moore and his men had to fight hard to overcome machine gun posts on the right flank. Although American troops now had the upper hand in the battle, it still took them one more day to eliminate the last enemy from the hamlets. On the morning of January 30th, LZ-4 was still under heavy enemy fire. However, as day went on, the pressure weakened, allowing the air-cap battalions to clear the hamlets from enemy presence. After 3 days of bitter fighting, Charlie Company finally managed to break out of Landing Zone 4 and continue with Operation Masher. By February 1st, most of the heavy fighting was over. During the 3-day Battle of Coulee at LZ-4, 77 cavalrymen were killed and another 220 wounded, including the 42 men of A Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and the 4 crewmen, 10 helicopter pilots, and 7 Green Beret. The grand total came to 140 Americans killed. Due to heavy casualties, the soldiers of the Air Cavalry nicknamed the area the Graveyard. Though the cost was high, the 1st Air Cavalry Division had defeated the Viet Cong on the battlefield and driven them from the region. Yet within a week, intelligence reports mentioned Viet Cong forces returning to the sector. Bien Dien Province would remain problematic throughout the war. Thank you for watching this episode. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified for the next drop into combat. Stay tuned.